The Al-Qaeda organization gained centrality among militant organizations as a result of the role of key members during the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Through their participation in the logistical organization known as the Maktab al-Khidmat, the MAK, or the Services Bureau, bin Laden and his key associates networked extensively with recruits and organizations from around the world who had traveled to support the defensive jihad of the Afghan Mujahideen. And so what we've got here in this chart is a very rough sort of depiction of the fact that the anti-Soviet jihad brought in local jihadist groups and individuals from a host of different regions from around the world, as well as irredentist jihadist groups and individuals from regions around the world. And something really unique happens during this 10-year period, really enabled by bin Laden's sort of parent organization led by Abdullah Azzam, the MAK. A new understanding of jihad was formed, and it was this maximalist understanding of defensive jihad, the idea that it was an individual Muslim's duty, no matter what country they might reside in, to come and fight on behalf of any Muslim community anywhere. So this maximalist idea of defensive jihadism becomes or grows into what we understand today as global jihadism. As veterans of the anti-Soviet jihad who have trained or fought or indoctrinated with one another, who have recognized that aspects of their grievance in Chechnya might resemble aspects of grievances in Egypt, which might represent aspects of grievances in Southeast Asia. These individuals eventually bleed out of Afghanistan. Some of them go back to existing groups around the world. Some of them start their own groups inspired by what they saw and did and accomplished during the anti-Soviet jihad. So, for example, the Abu Sayyaf group. This is a group named after an Afghan guerrilla, but created to fight in Southeast Asia by Southeast Asian. You have groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which fought in the anti-Soviet jihad, were also inspired by Abdullah Azzam, but were really repurposed, put down largely by the Pakistani state after the anti-Soviet jihad to fight in Kashmir against the Indian state. So you have this really complex set of networks that evolve between groups after the end of the anti-Soviet jihad, and some of those groups actually go on to formally affiliate with Al-Qaeda core. So you can think of, I can ask the question, has anyone ever heard of Tawhid wal-Jihad, a Jordanian terrorist group, a local terrorist group in Jordan? Tawhid wal-Jihad later becomes Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Zarqawi. So you have an example of an existing group that networks, fights alongside of Al-Qaeda, has a shared history, is eventually influenced by a key Al-Qaeda core military commander named Saif al-Adil to position itself in Iraq in advance of the U.S. occupation in Iraq, and therefore becomes Al-Qaeda core's lead organization, changing its name, in fact, to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I mentioned already the Salafist group for preaching in combat becoming Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So you have this idea of former affiliates that make Al-Qaeda look bigger than it actually is. Remember, Al-Qaeda core is this small organization, but it's now reorienting the violence of other organizations. But not everybody can go home, so to speak. Not everyone belongs to a group. And so you also have this dispersion of veterans of the anti-Soviet jihad who go to places other than their countries of origin. So you see a lot of individuals settle in places like the UK, in Spain, in Yemen, where there was no prohibition against veterans returning from the anti-Soviet jihad, unlike in places like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, where veterans of the anti-Soviet jihad were not allowed to return, by and large. And so you have this network of atomized individuals that also share this history with what will become Al-Qaeda core and this large sea of other like-minded organizations. And together, these four different groups help to go on to inspire a new generation of Al-Qaeda wannabes or Al-Qaeda inspired soldiers, either through online propaganda or because they meet in the real world and one inspires the other. What this means, of course, is that the threat of global jihadism is much bigger and much less easy to predict than the threat represented by Al-Qaeda core. Right? You have organizations that have taken on lives of their own influenced by the geopolitical or contextual environments in which they operate. You have organizations like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which are very close cousins, in fact, a derivative organization of Al-Qaeda Corps. In terms of its original leadership, as that leadership has evolved over time, you can trace it back to Al-Qaeda Corps in 2001. To groups like Al-Shabaab, which have always really been their own organization, in which Al-Qaeda Corps has tried to inject its own key operatives to change the course of those organizations. And so the output here is really hard to predict, horribly violent, fairly well networked, but not very predictable. It isn't necessarily, therefore, going to be very effective at creating some sort of pan-Islamic outcome. Instead, it's much more likely to generate high levels of violence in local and regional contexts, but to what effect, with what efficacy, we really can't say. To look at it conceptually, I think, is important. Those 5 different outputs of anti-Soviet jihad from the last slide are represented here in this Venn diagram. Again, global jihadism is now a much broader phenomenon than just the Al-Qaeda organization. But we can see that Al-Qaeda Corps represents has occupied a central place conceptually since even before the anti-Soviet jihad. What I think is really important to understand is how dynamic the different sections of this Venn diagram are. That individuals who are inspired by some aspect of this idea, whether it's the idea of defensive jihad and the fight of the Afghan Taliban against U.S. occupation, or the idea of promoted by Inspire magazine and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Right? There are multiple grievances. There are multiple geographic locations. There are multiple strategic narratives, all of which might be appealing to different individuals for different reasons, which means that radicalization and recruitment is much more diverse and hard to predict than it was. There are a lot more entry points into this violent community.